Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Slimeboss here, and welcome back to another Let's Chat. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the idea of the sequel. You see, I watched this recent video about some of people's favorite sequels in gaming over on GVG. I highly recommend you check out that video because it's interesting from a sort of podcast perspective, just people's personal favorite sequels. But the idea of a sequel really spoke to me when I was watching through Liam Triforce's 2 videos on Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker. When I came to realize that being a sequel is a lot more than just slapping a number 2 on it. And today I want to talk to you guys about 3 examples, well, 3 different series examples of what a sequel can be, because it's more than just expanding on the story. So first, I want to talk to you guys about a more basic example of a sequel, and the first, these are just basically slapping the number 2 on it. These are Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Mario 2, and specifically like USA version of Mario 2, and like Crash Bandicoot 2, and any game that pretty much has like a 2 in front of it. And a sequel can really be up to 2 different, or a basic sequel can be up to 2 different ideas. The first idea is making the sequel pretty much just be a continuation of that game's story if you're planning on making a trilogy. So this is basically what movies tend to do whenever they make their original intention is to make a trilogy, where it's basically a literal sequel, the next step, the next arc, however it may be. With the difference between Mario 2 and Mario Sunshine is that Mario 2 seems to feel like Crash 2 and Sonic 2 and Mario Sunshine is that Sonic 2 seems to be a continuation of the Sonic 1 story, while Super Mario Sunshine is more or less just another game in a respective franchise, even though technically it's a sequel to a game. Another example of this basic form of sequel, Super Mario Galaxy 2. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is obviously a literal sequel to Mario Galaxy in every single aspect. It's just more of the same. It's a continuation of the original game story in some respect, and it's just, again, an expansion off of the original game's idea. This is the most basic idea for a sequel, and that is where I want to bring into my next thought, I guess, is my personal favorite sequel, Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver. Pokemon Gold and Silver are the quintessential, and to me personally, the base value for when it comes to sequels. Now, and again, this could be taken differently. If you have, the same character going on a new adventure, that's fine. But the way in which Pokemon Gold completely twists on its head what the meaning of a sequel can be is just astounding to me. Obviously, every single Pokemon generation after this point has kind of pretty much become dull, because it doesn't really extenuate, it's just basically more Pokemon, while Gold and Silver was the first of these, and it didn't really extenuate that. It just felt like more Pokemon in a different way. And this idea is continued further when you return to Kanto. And this idea of returning to Kanto really makes it feel like a sequel to me. And, if they would have just ended it, at the end of the Elite Four, had 0 ties to the original game, then that's when it would be more like a future Pokemon game. And I'm not going to talk about Black and White 2 because I've actually never played that or experienced that in any way, even though I'm a, massive Pokemon fan. But I don't really know how much of a sequel Black and White 2 is compared to its original, at least in the same way as Pokemon Gold and Silver. And to be honest with you, even though Gold and Silver aren't my favorite Pokemon games in the series, it are definitely one of the ones that are higher up there, and definitely, most definitely, one of my favorite sequels of all time. So, returning to Kanto and the true final boss of the game, and spoilers if you haven't played Pokemon Gold yet, don't know how you haven't, you fight Red as the true final boss of the game, which, if you don't know, Red is the original character of the Pokemon Red and Blue. And something that I've also kind of been churning in my head is when I believe it was Game Theory, it was either Game Theory or some Pokemon theorist channel that talked about, who really is Red and Gold, and it was sort of like a sequel video, or not a sequel video. They're sort of connected together. And what they came up with is that both Red and Gold are the most unique Pokemon main characters ever. And that is because they pretty much are a blank slate. While later generations actually put emotion and thought into some of the characters, either by context clues in the games or by the anime, most of the characters or the two most blank slates of characters in Pokemon have to be the first two generations of Pokemon. And I want to make a difference between Gold and Ethan, because I believe Ethan is the one with the most personality, with his inclusion in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which kind of ruins his character a little bit. But the fact that these two blank slates are put at odds, the fact that Red as a character is pretty much the quintessential blank slate. Like everyone, you talk about Chrono, you talk about, some of these basic RPG characters that they don't have really any personality, but eventually they do in sequels. And Red to me also has this sort of attribute, but you still look at him in future games and being like, that was me. I was playing as him as a kid, like when he returned in Let's Go or when he returned in Generation 7. He's still a blank slate. He's just sort of an empty husk. And it's the weirdest thing, is that it's almost like there is no character there without you, the player. And I guess what's the coolest thing about that is you actually get to fight your past self in a way. And that is probably one of the biggest reasons why I feel it's a sequel, because it's not only a sequel in the game world, but it's also a sequel for you. It's a continuation. It's not a continuation of the main character's adventures. It's a continuation of your adventures in the Pokemon world, and that is why Gold and Silver is so interesting to me. And what's even cooler is that Heart Gold Soul Silver is one of the few remakes that sort of accentuizes this thesis. Don't forget, Pokemon Gold and Silver were meant to be the last Pokemon games in the franchise, and they pretty much completed this goal wholeheartedly. It was a sequel, it was a finale, it truly ended the Pokemon series, and that's why I believe that, Pokemon games that came after, they're sort of experimental. That, Generation 3 through 5 are pretty much just kind of basic, bland, boring continuation of the Pokemon formula because it's the biggest franchise ever. But then you come into Gen 6, Gen 7, Gen 8, and probably Gen 9 is where the Pokemon Company started to experiment with things, specifically with like Mega Evolution and Legends Arceus and the entirety of Generation 7 as a whole. They're trying to do something different with the formula, which, is alright, I guess. But back to the topic at hand is that most remakes tend to just take what was so great about the original and re-encapsulate it in a jar and then sell it again. And, sometimes, they rebuild the game from the ground up, like Final Fantasy VII Remake, or they just remake the graphics, like Mario All-Stars or Link's Awakening. And all remakes are good in their own right. It's just, when you look at games like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where it's pretty much a from the ground up remake, and it's more than just that too, because they take the best of Diamond and Pearl, which is the graphics and the gameplay mechanics and all of that, and the Pokemon, and then they take the world of Generation 2, and they still somehow come out creating something new without leaning too hard on what remakes are meant to be, just encapsulating the original feel of the game, sometimes completely changing it like in Final Fantasy VII, but most remakes tend to wane on the side of nostalgia, where Heart Gold Soul Silver does that, but it also further takes the thesis of what Gold and Silver was and runs with it as far as it possibly can, because not only does it expand the world of what Johto and Kanto are in remake form, but it also takes the idea of both the sequel and the final Pokemon game to its true limit. Honestly, I don't know any other Pokemon game that is as full or as expansive as Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And finally, I want to talk to you guys about a more interesting form of sequel. So we talked about the basic form, we talked about my favorite form, and I want to talk to you guys about The Legend of Zelda, because again, like I said at the beginning of this video, Liam Triforce made me really think of Zelda as a whole, because there isn't really a true quote-unquote sequel in the Zelda franchise, other than maybe Majora's Mask and probably Breath of the Wild too, who knows. But sequels in Zelda have always just been interesting. Oh, and I guess technically Phantom Hourglass as well, but that it doesn't, you know, even though it has elements of Wind Waker, it doesn't really truly feel like a sequel. You can play that game, you know, it's the next game after Wind Waker, but it doesn't continue with what Wind Waker started. And it's kind of hard to make a sequel off of a sequel, and I'll get into that here in a second. You see, The Legend of Zelda, it starts off with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is praised as one of the best video games of all time ever. And obviously it's older and kind of archaic in some areas, but it pretty much is one of the few games that pioneered the 3D game and open world style nature of video games. And you have, doesn't matter what kind of fan you are, you have to respect that game for all of the immense things that have done to push the industry forward. And I think Nintendo, for a while there, and it's happening again with Breath of the Wild, where they're so stuck on this idea of how great Ocarina of Time is that they never really push the formula forward in any way. And it's not like because, you know, future games like Wind Waker are bad in any way, and, you know, they all have their own unique gimmicks, but they're all sort of tethered in a different way to Ocarina of Time, in a pseudo-sequel fashion. And even Breath of the Wild has this too, where every single future 3D Zelda game from this point forward is somehow tethered to Ocarina of Time, and echoes what that original game was trying to convey. And we see this in Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask is quite honestly one of the literal sequels in any Zelda game. You have pretty much the exact same level format as Ocarina of Time, you have the exact same graphic style as Ocarina of Time, and you have the exact same main character. It is the most basic sequel of all time, but Majora's Mask does something interesting, because obviously Ocarina of Time is where the split path happens in the timeline, etc., etc., but what's interesting about Majora's Mask is that it has its own, you know, 3D gimmick, but it tries to reinvigorate the formula while also still trying to be a sequel to Ocarina of Time, which is kind of cool, but also it's I mean, I can give it a pass. I can give it a pass for Majora's Mask because, you know, obviously it was still an N64 title, and it's a great game, don't get me wrong, but it's tethered to Ocarina of Time in the most natural way possible, and it's understandable. It's, you know, it's pretty much a just most generic sequel that you can come up with. And then obviously, you know, having its own 3D time gimmick makes it a more unique game from that point forward, but its tether to Ocarina of Time is fine, it's understandable. And then you get into Wind Waker, which isn't a direct sequel in the same way, you know, you have the same characters, a similar feeling world. This is an entirely new Zelda game, and this is a game that if you play it, if you think about it on the base level, you know, it's pretty much its standalone Zelda game. You have its connection to Phantom Hourglass, you have its, you know, its world building, it's its own Zelda game, just as much Zelda 1 is, just as much as Majora's Mask is, or just as much as Ocarina of Time is, just as much as Breath of the Wild is. And yet, if you really look into the deeper, you know, reading between the lines, and if you watch Liam Triforce's video on it, Wind Waker is just as much as a sequel to Ocarina of Time as Majora's Mask is. And it's crazy to think about, because it's almost like, it's not like a sequel, you know, in the same way as you think about a sequel, where it's like the same character going on a new adventure, or the same character continuing their adventure from the last time that you saw them. But it takes this idea of making a sequel of the world. And that is a very fascinating idea. You see it in the remnants of areas that you explore. You see it in the remnants of, you know, the fact that Hyrule is completely submerged. You see it in the remnants in the music. You see it in the people. It is quite honestly the weirdest thing, or the weirdest sequel you could ever think about. And obviously, you know, that wasn't their main hook. That wasn't the push. It wasn't supposed to be, you know, if you're one of those casual Zelda fans that plays through it casually, you're not going to notice these small little subtle details. And these aren't Easter eggs. These are whatever. They're basically embedded within the story that Wind Waker tells, and is a major part of its thesis that it's trying to convey. And again, this is the most interesting way that it's tethered to Ocarina of Time, but it feels like it almost needs to be, and it doesn't need to be the case. It's interesting to look at from a retrospective kind of way, but it feels like it's being tempered by the fact that it has to be connected to such a great game, and it's the weirdest thing to me. And then Twilight Princess gets even worse, and Twilight Princess is born out of the fact that fans didn't like Wind Waker when it first came out. They didn't like the art style, and even though Twilight Princess is not a sequel to Ocarina in any way, shape, or form, except for like maybe the Skull Kid and the whole time Temple of Time section in that game. I feel like Twilight Princess's thesis is built off of what Wind Waker didn't do correctly, and it was almost built and created out of anguish and anger for a better world, a better game. And it's basically like, okay, well, we have this great game and we have this not so great game, so we need to create a new game that sort of ties back to the original game. And I don't really know how to explain it, but it just feels like it is not tethered to the original game in any sort of sequel manner, not in world building, not in literal sequel. It is just so hell-bent on satisfying the Ocarina of Time crowd that it suffers for it. It basically has this horrible, washed out graphic style that was okay during the time, but not so much anymore. And all of this is, accumulating, to the fact that they wanted to create Ocarina of Time again, and they wanted to make it bigger, and they wanted to make it more for the time. And that is why Twilight Princess is so weird to me. And so even though you don't, might not think of Ocarina of Time as a sequel in any way, shape, or form, and I don't either, I just think that it's very interesting that it's tethered to Ocarina of Time, and they try to re-encapsulate what Ocarina of Time did before a whole new generation, and it sucks. And it really sucks. And it feels like you have Majora's Mask, which is like, okay, that's a cool it's just a sequel. And then you have Wind Waker, which is like, okay, that's interesting. It's a subliminal sequel. And then you have Twilight Princess, which is just like, it's not a sequel, but it's just like tethered to Ocarina of Time in the weirdest way possible. And this is where it gets interesting. Breath of the Wild is not tethered to Ocarina of Time at all. It finally pushes the Zelda formula in a way that you don't really think about. It takes the ideas of what Ocarina of Time is and it pushes it forward, just like any next game in a franchise should. It is the most traditional way of not being a quote-unquote sequel, but the next game in a franchise. And they haven't really had this since Ocarina of Time. They weren't so intrinsically locked to a past game, or I forget what the emotion is or the word is. It just feels like they had to respect the original game and be connected to it somehow. While with Breath of the Wild, it finally did something new and entirely experimental. It was open world. It was all these different things, but it's not. I feel like the shackles of Ocarina of Time have finally been broken with Breath of the Wild. And obviously it still respects what Ocarina of Time does. It sort of takes that idea and expands it, and it does the things that, next games and franchises should, but it doesn't feel like it's so hell-bent on being connected to a past game in the series. And Skyward Sword is a weird, interesting spot, because it's not the strongest Zelda game by any means, but it's in this weird middle ground where it's its own unique experience, but it's not that good of a game. It's almost like the stepping stone to what Breath of the Wild could be. And this is where we get into the most interesting question. What type of sequel could Breath of the Wild 2 be? Could it be... A lot of people are speculating that it's probably going to be a more Majora's Mask type sequel. But to me, I'm going to have to agree with that. But the only thing that I'm going to sort of end up having a problem with is that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to end up being the Majora's Mask to Ocarina of Time. And then we're gonna probably end up having the same case scenario that we had with Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, where the games need to somehow be intrinsically aligned or connected with Breath of the Wild, and they almost need to relive the time that has been passed, because you can only do something so great once, and you can't keep recapturing that idea in a bottle. And it was okay with Wind Waker because it was an interesting take on what a sequel could be, but with Twilight Princess, they basically tried to recreate what they had, and it didn't work. And although it's a great game, you can see how much they needed to be connected with Ocarina of Time, and thus it faltered in that way. Breath of the Wild is probably going to end up having the same case, and I have no doubt that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be great. But this idea of a sequel can be stretched and molded in so many different ways, and that's why Wind Waker is so great. But we need to, as an industry, we need to be able to stretch and mold this creative idea that is the sequel without being repetitive like Pokemon, without being so connected to the original game that was just the best game in the franchise to yourself, or just by making a most generic sequel that you possibly can. The idea of the sequel is an interesting idea, and there's so much you can do with it, and that is why I love it so much, is because there's almost like 3 different types of games to me. There's the sequel, there's original game, solely original, there's the sequel, and there's the remake. And the sequel and the remake are interesting because they both somehow need to be bound to an original game. And to me, games like Mario Galaxy or Mario 3D Land or Mario Odyssey are all unique games, but they all have some other game that's sort of bound to it. And although it's cool to, and although this is why we need the industry to experiment for what remakes and sequels can be, when you take a sequel and it's so intrinsically bound to the original game, you start having a weaker game to boot. And although I'm a personal favorite of having just more of the same, in an era where we have DLC, having a sequel where it's just more of the same doesn't just hit as well as it did back in the day. And they need this, I don't know, I just find the idea of the sequel to be really interesting, and that it could be experimented with. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Sorry if I didn't make any sense, but I hope you guys understand that the main point of this video is to say that being a sequel is interesting, and that they need to start experimenting with that more instead of just slapping a number 2 on it. Have a great day.